I think a lot of us, when we envision the Old West, one of the first things that comes to mind is whiskey. The dingy saloon, the shot glass sliding down the bar, and the dusty gunfighter throwing back one last drink before the big showdown. And honestly, that's really not too far off from reality, at least the whiskey part. That stuff was literally everywhere. But then again, so were a lot of other substances. Believe it or not, you could stroll into a drugstore in places like Tombstone in the 1870s and walk out with an entire arsenal of intoxicants. Type of stuff that nowadays land you in a federal prison. Opium, morphine, cocaine, cannabis, all of it completely legal and available over the counter, sitting on a shelf right next to the soap and horse liniment. And that's what we'll be discussing today, drug use in the Old West. And just to keep things authentic, I am recording this episode under the influence of airplane glue, whippets, Spanish fly, and an expired ibuprofen I found under the seat of my pickup. At least I think that's what it is. We'll find out soon enough, right? Did cowboys smoke weed? Was cocaine really used to treat children's toothaches? And how true are the stories about Wild Bill Hickok and Kit Carson being dope fiends? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! All right, first up, we have a drug that damn near every other substance on today's list is either related to, derived from, or was invented in hopes of replacing. And that drug is a little something known as morphine. Now, for all you squares out there, morphine was first isolated from the opium poppy by a German pharmacist back in the early 1800s. Skip ahead a couple of decades, and it was already being commercially manufactured and marketed to the general public. And for good reason, it really is one hell of a painkiller. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most addictive substances on Earth. And it became even more addictive in the 1850s, thanks to a brand new invention called the hypodermic syringe. Once they figured out how to inject a precise dose straight into the bloodstream, morphine became the go-to painkiller for everyone from battlefield surgeons to frontier sawbones. Hell, for a while there were even some doctors who thought that injecting morphine was less habit-forming than swallowing it on account of bypassing the appetite. Now, speaking of battlefields, you'll often hear that the Civil War produced an entire generation of morphine addicts, a condition sometimes referred to as the soldier's disease. And that is partially true, as there were definitely surgeons who were handing out opiates like candy. And some of those boys did come home addicted. But the actual scale was nowhere near what a lot of sources would have you believe. In fact, the term soldier's disease barely even appears in the contemporary documents. And historians who have actually studied 19th century addiction, guys like David Courtwright, found that the claims of hundreds of thousands of addicted veterans was almost certainly exaggerated. Truth is, your typical opiate addicts of the 19th century weren't veterans at all. They were mostly middle-aged, middle-class white women, hooked up by their own physicians who prescribed them opium-based medicines for everything from cramps to quote-unquote nervous complaints. Only problem was it was pretty expensive and kind of hard to come by in quantity out on the frontier, which ended up leaving the door wide open for morphine's older and cheaper cousin, opium. Now, opium arrived out west pretty much around the same time as the gold rush, carried by the thousands of Chinese immigrants who labored for the mines and railroads. From there, the habit slowly spread outward to the general population, and for a while, it went almost completely unregulated. You could buy it, sell it, smoke it, even drink it. We'll talk about regulations here in just a moment, but what about opium dens? We've all seen them in the movies, right? Like in Tombstone or Macabre and Mrs. Miller. And those dens absolutely existed. Even Billy the Kid's brother Joseph was said to frequent opium dens back in Silver City. Now, before anyone brings up Wild Bill Hickok, I have also heard those rumors, but I've yet to find a single primary source backing them up. As far as I can tell, the whole idea of Hickok using opium originated from Pete Dexter's 1986 novel Deadwood, which, along with the screenplay, helped to inspire the movie Wild Bill starring Jeff Bridges. Great movie, but it's not a documentary. As far as the actual historical record, we know Hickok enjoyed gambling and drinking, but there's not really any contemporary evidence showing that he used opium. At least not that I've seen. And hey, since we're talking about the movies, remember that scene in Tombstone when Curly Bill came staggering out of an opium den and gunned down Marshall White? Pretty cool scene, but it's almost completely fictional. Don't get me wrong, the real Curly Bill did indeed kill the marshal, but every contemporary account, including testimony from Wyatt Earp, describes Brocious as drunk as opposed to high. In other words, there's nothing in the actual records indicating that he used opium. Now, that said, the most common way that people on the frontier consumed opium was through laudanum. That's what John Wayne was drinking in the movie The Shootist. Or if you've ever seen the HBO series Deadwood, remember Alma Garrett? That little concoction she'd drink while she stared out the window? That was laudanum. And all it was basically was opium dissolved in alcohol, usually flavored with some type of syrup to cut the bitterness. And it really did become the cure-all of the 19th century. Doctors prescribed it for toothaches, headaches, menstrual cramps, diarrhea, snake bites, gunshot wounds, teething babies, and even something they politely referred to as female complaints. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and unfortunately, it also built a tolerance pretty damn fast, meaning that users needed bigger and bigger doses just to get the same relief. And on a darker note, laudanum was also one of the most common methods of suicide, especially amongst the soiled doves. Matter of fact, it was the lethal dose of laudanum that killed Wyatt Earp's wife, Maddie Blaylock. Common law wife, Maddie Blaylock. I know if I didn't say it was common law, then somebody would have called me out on it. So like I said, pretty dark stuff, right? But here's the thing about laudanum. It did not discriminate. That little bottle ran through every layer of frontier society, from the poorest crib girls all the way up to some of the most celebrated names in the Old West. And I do mean the most celebrated. Hell, even the great Kit Carson used laudanum. Now, granted, he was dying at the time, so it wasn't like he was using it recreationally, but he did use it. And then, when even that wasn't enough, his doctor dosed him with chloroform. Or how about our old friend Doc Holliday? If you caught my series on Doc, you might recall that in addition to the whiskey, he also spent his final years self-medicating with laudanum. Hey, just real quick, if you're enjoying this latest edition of the Wild West Extravaganza, you might also want to check out the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. For just $5 a month, you will get every single episode ad-free, plus early releases and access to bonus content you can't find anywhere else, including the really embarrassing early stuff. And on top of all that, 20% of every single dollar earned through Patreon goes directly to charity. So not only will you be supporting your favorite podcast, but you'll also be helping to make the world a better place. That's patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Patreon.com/Wild West Extra, or just click the link down below that says Patreon. Okay, so with all these substances floating around, you're probably wondering when the law finally got involved. I know we tend to assume that none of this stuff was regulated until like the 20th century, when the federal government stuck its head in. But in all reality, the first real crackdowns came much earlier, and they came at a local level. Virginia City, for example, they banned opium dens in September of 1876. Hell, they even made it illegal to possess a pipe. Only thing is, these laws weren't really about public health, at least not in the way you might think. You see, the actual enforcement was extremely selective. As long as opium use remained confined to the Chinese laborers, the authorities really didn't care. What finally triggered the crackdown was when white people, especially white women, began showing up in those same dens, taking up the pipe. So it wasn't the opium that scared the authorities, so much as who they were using it with and who they were lying next to while they were using it. But even then, you could still buy it at the drugstores. Like I said, they didn't actually ban opium itself. All they did was outlaw the Chinese way of consuming it. But laudanum, that candy-flavored tincture we discussed a minute ago, it stayed right there on the shelf, no questions asked. And besides, it just so happened that around that same period, drugstores were stocking up with yet another miracle of modern science known as cocaine. Ah, yeah, now we're talking. And by talking, I do mean literally all night. Just a bunch of gibberish and teeth grinding, everybody talking over one another and nobody listening to a goddamn word of it. Now, cocaine was first isolated from the coca leaf around the year 1860, and by the 1880s, it was being marketed across the United States as a genuine miracle, a cure for melancholy, fatigue, indigestion, asthma, and I swear I'm not making this next one up, but they also thought it was a cure for morphine addiction. Basically just trading one monkey for another. And when I say it was in everything, I do mean everything. You had cocaine lozenges, cocaine tonics, cocaine wine. Hell, some pharmaceutical companies even sold handy little kits that came with their own syringes. There were even cocaine toothache drops marketed specifically for children. But as far as how widespread the use was on the frontier, it was sort of a late arrival. By the time it was truly everywhere, like the late 1890s and the early 1900s, the frontier was already getting ready to close up shop. I'm also not aware of any famous Westerners who used it. I know Thomas Edison allegedly drank cocaine wine, and so did Pope Leo XIII. But the best example I could find that's at least somewhat Old West adjacent is Ulysses S. Grant. And even then, it was just during his last few months as he suffered from throat cancer. Apparently, his doctor would give him strong enough doses to dull the pain so he could keep on writing his book. And as fate would have it, he did finish his book just days before his death. So in other words, one of the most celebrated works in American history was completed with the assistance of cocaine. And it certainly wasn't the last. Now, I know this next part is a little off topic, but I was actually curious, so I looked into it. Turns out all the stories about cocaine being in Coca-Cola are true. You see, Coke was invented in 1886 by an Atlanta pharmacist named John Pemberton. He had served in the Confederate Army and got slashed up pretty bad during the Battle of Columbus. And like so many other wounded veterans, he came out the other side addicted to morphine. Now, his original product was a cocaine wine, and part of what he was chasing, both as a businessman and reportedly for his own habit, was an alternative to morphine. And then when the temperance laws hit Atlanta is when he pulled out the alcohol and replaced it with a sugar syrup. And just like that, Coca-Cola was born. And yes, those early batches did contain cocaine, just not very much. They'd eventually start phasing it out around the turn of the century, but from what I understand, there were still some trace amounts, all the way up to around 1929. Okay, but what about cannabis? And more importantly, did cowboys smoke weed? Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but probably not. Some of them might have eaten it, but even that was relatively rare, at least during the 19th century. Now, be that as it may, it was available and it was legal. That much is definitely true. Even as early as the 1850s, you can find it in pharmacies in the form of tinctures and extracts, prescribed for everything from migraines to insomnia. So could a cowboy in 1875 have gotten cannabis in his system? Absolutely, legally and over the counter. But the actual practice of smoking marijuana, that really didn't come about until the turn of the century, and even then it was just mostly along the border with Mexico. Now keep in mind we are talking about drug use in the Old West. People have been smoking weed since even before Jesus, but as far as the American frontier is concerned, it really didn't see a widespread use until the 1900s. Now, I have heard other stories about it growing wild in certain places out west, and cowboys occasionally using it as sort of a stand-in for tobacco, but from what I understand, there's really not much evidence backing that up. Now, eating the stuff was an entirely different matter. Kind of. There was actually a company out of New York called the Gunjawalla Company that sold hash candy through mail-order newspaper ads and billed it as a harmless and pleasurable stimulant. In fact, a writer named Fritz Ludlow became famous in 1857 for a book titled The Hashish Eater, all about his own experiences gobbling down cannabis extract. And then just a few years later, in 1863, Ludlow crossed the Great Plains all the way to California. So while I can't prove that any cowboys ever ate hash candy around the campfire, I can tell you that at least one certified car-carrying weed enthusiast absolutely rode the trail west. As for cowboys chewing it like tobacco, once again, I really couldn't find any evidence that that was ever a thing. And I think that's just mostly due to what I said earlier about it being concentrated around the border with Mexico. I know I'm repeating myself here, but it wasn't until the early 1900s that it really began taking off. Okay, before we get to the grand finale, there is one more substance I do think is worth discussing. And unlike cocaine and marijuana, this one was actually used by a very famous frontier figure. I'm talking about peyote, and the famous figure in question was none other than the great Quanah Parker. If you've ever seen the movie Young Guns, this is the same stuff they were on when Dirty Steve saw that giant chicken. And I'm not gonna lie, I've never taken any type of hallucinogenics, but if Lou Diamond Phillips ever shows up at my door with his face painted up like Skeletor, wanting to take me on a vision quest, I'm in 100%, no questions asked. Now, if you're not familiar, peyote's a tiny little cactus that grows in the Southwest, and when consumed, it can produce very powerful visions. The native peoples of Mexico had been using it in ceremonies for thousands of years. Then, over the second half of the 19th century, the practice spread north onto the southern Great Plains, passing from tribe to tribe until it finally reached the Comanches and Kiowas. And that's where Quanah Parker enters the picture. Quanah, of course, in addition to being the son of a Comanche war chief, Pete Nakona, and a white captive named Cynthia Ann Parker, was himself considered the last great war chief of the Comanche. After surrendering in 1875, he sort of reinvented himself as a businessman and rancher, arguably becoming one of the most influential Native Americans of his generation. And somewhere along the way, he also became the single most prominent advocate of peyote in the United States. In fact, he spent the rest of his life both practicing and defending it, testifying against anti-peyote legislation and even helping to shape the movement that after his death would formally be organized as the Native American Church. He's even credited with one of the all-time great quotes on the subject. The white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus. The Indian goes into his teepee and talks to Jesus. Now, was peyote a recreational drug? Not really. For the Comanche and other Plains tribes, it was more like medicine and religion just rolled into one. But if the question of the day is which famous Westerners were actually using mind-altering substances, That's your answer. The best documented user of psychedelics in the entire Old West also happened to be the last war chief of the Comanche. Now, let's say you were living back in the 1890s and none of this stuff was helping. You tried the cocaine wine, you drank the laudanum, maybe even experimented with weed lozenges, but nothing was working. Well, that's where a company known as Bayer Pharmaceutical comes into play. Maybe you've heard of them. You see, back in 1898, they too introduced a brand new product that promised not only to soothe your cough, but to also cure your pesky little morphine addiction. That's right, a cough syrup that was marketed as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. They even recommended it for children. Hell, Bayer was so proud of their new miracle compound that they named it after the German word heroisch. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it means heroic. And it got that name on account of the fill-in that it gave the test subjects. Or as it's called nowadays, heroin. Or heron if you're Chris Tucker. Talk about the good old days, man. Grandma's cough syrup was heroin. Baby's teeth and drops were cocaine, and the entire family washed down supper with a nice glass of wine-flavored speedball. But as far as the Old West specifically, outside of stuff like laudanum and opium dens, there really doesn't appear to have been all that much recreational drug use. The frontier's true drug of choice was simply whiskey. And look, I know there's a lot of stuff online claiming that weed grew wild all across the frontier, and the cowboys were passing joints from Texas all the way up to Montana. And I totally get the appeal, it makes for a great story, but there's just no evidence of widespread use. No diaries, no letters, no arrest records, nothing like that. We've got contemporary sources describing opium dens and laudanum overdoses. We've got city ordinances and state laws regulating dope as early as the 1870s, and we've even got ads for cocaine toothache drops. The paper trail as far as frontier drug use is a mile long, but cowboys smoking weed, like I said, there's really nothing out there. Just remember that there is a difference between what was available and what was actually used. Could a cowboy have bought cannabis at a drugstore in the 1870s? Absolutely. Did most of them ever do that? Not really, at least not according to the evidence. And I guess that's about all I've got on dope in the Old West. But hey, what do you think? Did any of this surprise you? Did I miss anything? Was I way off base? Hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, drop a comment down below. Thank you so much for joining me. And speaking of whiskey, I do hope you'll do the same next week when we discuss the great Calamity Jane. All right, until then, adios.